So firstly, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along to this session on transparency as a foundation in cyber. I'll give you a quick introduction. So I'm Dr. Charles Clarke. I'm the Director of Operations at CSE Connect, which is a national cybersecurity education body. We've got a mission to enhance national workforce aptitude and competency. We do that typically through a number of mechanisms. So we've got 14 regional hubs across the country. We use those hubs to effectively share local practice regionally. And then we also use them to help deliver some of the initiatives that we run across the country. We have a growing portfolio of impact projects. We have an accelerator program, which essentially is our elite careers preparation program. And we also have something we're piloting very shortly called Share Hub, which is an opportunity for educators to sort of get together and collaborate on publishing shared resources that are informed by aptitude and competency. We also work nationally through the International Cybersecurity Education Collaborative, which we co-established with Insight in the USA. And we run a series of monthly online morning coffee afternoon tea sessions we call MCAT. We run hackathons, workshops, all sorts of things. And just as a shameless plug, on the 23rd, 24th of July, we'll be running our annual conference at Abertay University. And you're welcome to come along for those that have the time and the interest. So a quick overview of the format for this panel. So the format, we have 4 questions. They'll be looking at transparency in the context of compliance obligations, imposition in supply chains, institutional practice, and workforce development. Each question is accompanied by a short Slido poll, which we hope you'll take part in, because we'll then use that to feed into the conversations from the panelists. I have to say, and I often reflect, that I'm very lucky to work within such a vibrant, engaging and active community, and that's represented today on the panel. So I am going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So Natalie, can we kick off with you, please?
Thank you, Charles. I'm Dr. Natalie. I'm head of the Department of Cybersecurity and Computing at Abertay University, and also one of the co-founders of CSE Connect.
Yeah, I'm Professor Keith Martin from Royal Holloway, University of London. I'm director of our Academic Centre of Excellence in Cybersecurity Education, and I run a doctoral training centre at Royal Holloway in cybersecurity. My background is in cryptography, but my real academic home is here in Glasgow. I studied maths just up the road in Hill Head, so I'm very pleased to be back.
Good afternoon all. I'm Phil Legg, Professor of Cybersecurity at University of the West of England, and also our co-director of our Academic Centre of Excellence in Cybersecurity Education, and I'm also a co-founder of CSE Connect. So thank you.
Hi, good afternoon everybody. I'm Findlay Whitelaw. I'm probably the anomaly in this panel. I'm a practitioner, and I'd like to say a doctor in practice. I'm doing my doctoral degree, so not quite got there yet, but hopefully I'll be as esteemed as my lovely panellists here. But my background is rooted in running large-scale security operations centres, and I'm currently doing consultancy work with Exabeam as their field CISO.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Findlay. And although you don't have the doctor thing yet, we're getting there. So.
We're getting there.
So just to let everybody know, so you've got the Slido link, so if you don't mind scanning that, if you haven't done so already, you can actually complete all of the Slido sessions in advance. You don't have to wait for everyone to come up. The plan is that so I'll ask a question, we'll have a discussion around that question, we'll reveal some of the Slido input, and we'll use that to inform further questions and to prompt further answers from the panel. All right, does that sound fair? Great. All right, so let's kick off with the first question. Organisations often face a transparency tension between sharing details of a cyber incident and protecting their operational security. Where do you think the right balance lies, and who should decide? And Findlay, I think you're going to kick us off with this one.
So I think for me, I take a very practitioner view on this. It's not about secrecy and openness. It's probably in between being responsible and also responsibly disclosing, ahead of any premature certainty. So for me, I think that balance needs to be given. But in terms of who should be responsible, I think the question is, I think it needs to be a bit of both. I don't think it has to be the organisation going through the correct chain of commands, shall we say. But what I would probably like to make the point on is that a lot of organisations don't fully understand what it is that they're reporting. Therefore, that is where all the confusion, the hype, and the chaos can sometimes be created. And I, again, would take that back to, organisations need to be prepared. They need to be prepared up front, have their communication plans, have their scenario tests, really go out and make sure that they are, playing this out as if it was in a real environment. So I don't know if I've answered your question right away, but I do think that the onus is on the business, but it needs to have tight regulation in there, but we need to be really clear on being responsibly disclosing what they know with that certainty.
Awesome. There's a couple of points you mentioned there. So one of them was responsible disclosure, and you also talked about the idea that organisations don't understand. Can you elaborate a little bit on the responsible disclosure piece? Because I'm sure there are a lot of conflicts, and my good friend John over there will tell you when an organisation's got its tome of a playbook for what happens during an incident, that goes out the window. So, and really what tends to happen is it's those with those aptitudes that tend to sort of rise to the occasion. Yeah. So within your domain, and talking about responsible disclosure, can you elaborate a little bit on that, what that might mean?
So I think when I speak to organisations and we talk about, I am trying to, get ahead of or prevent any breaches, just because you've got controls in there, whether that be tools or whether that be, other controls within your environment, doesn't always mean that, you're going to be safe. So regardless of that, I would always say that you need to have your comms plan, you need to have that playbook, you need to test that playbook, you need to tailor that playbook, and you need to regularly update that playbook and keep going through it. Now, what I mean by regularly test that playbook, not just on paper. This is where you need to go in and actually say, right, we're going to simulate this, what worked well and what didn't work well. And that's where everybody's got their roles and responsibilities, and did it go to plan. Then you can do a bit of a debrief, or an autopsy, whatever you want to call it. And then you go back and you rewrite your playbook, what went well, what didn't go well, etc. That's what should be happening in practice.
Fantastic, thank you. Natalie, any thoughts on?
Yeah, if I could just add to what Findlay was saying, I think that this is often interpreted, I think, as a technical question or a question for the technical team, whereas in reality it's actually a leadership decision. I think if there is a cyber attack that's hitting an organisation, they will be dealing with significant uncertainty, tremendous operational demands, the potential for reputational risk, and that response to perhaps not being very transparent during attack would usually be a rational response given the pressure and the demands that they're under. And I think it's important that we recognise that as well and just make sure that there's appropriate structure and support there to help them make the right decisions so that we can then get the right lessons from that to benefit the wider ecosystem.
And I think there are lessons that can be learned. I mean, we've just gone through the whole Marks and Spencers. We'll just take that. There's others that have happened. But, they publicly announced to their customers and they kept them informed. They didn't go into all the minutiae of detail about what happened, but they announced enough to be able to tell people, do this, keep yourself safe, we're not taking online orders, etc., etc. And it's having that comms plan. So it's not about just disclosing everything, because obviously that would be crazy. But it's about having the right comms plan and where to use it and when.
And how important do you think that's been in terms of their recovery and reputation? Because I think, is there a correlation between the fact that they were quite open and did let their customers know what was happening and, the business has picked up?
Absolutely. I think people recognised that it was an institution and the customers rallied behind them. The operational disruption that it caused was huge. Reputationally, it was even bigger. But they're still in business today, and the community got behind them, not just the security community, but their customers too. And I think that level of communication, getting it right, saying, we don't know exactly what's happened, we're on it, we're working through it, but as a precaution, for example, we're going to stop online orders, but we can still serve, you should be doing X, Y, and Z. So, I think getting that balance, it was really key for them. And they seem to have, reputationally weathered that storm.
So I've got a bit of an honest disclosure. So I've worn an autographed shirt from Marks and Spencer, and that was purchased.
Oh, very nice.
So, all right, Keith.
Yeah, well, we were encouraged in the plenary this morning to go left field a little bit and look to other areas, and I thought I would do that, especially as the only thing I really know about is cryptography. And the main transparency issue in cryptography is probably really about algorithms. So whether you are transparent about the details of algorithms that you're using as opposed to keeping that secret. And that is a major transparency issue in cryptography. And the main argument for being transparent, essentially, and using things that everyone understands and can clearly see is, first of all, many eyes syndrome. So many people are able to look at what you're doing and comment. There's a compatibility issue, which is obviously if you are open and disclose, then in fact devices can talk to one another, people can share systems. But there's also a trust issue that if you're very open about the details of the technology you're using, then for a lot of people that increases trust. And I think these analogies do extend over into this operational side because if you are very open about incidents and you have a good chance of actually being more secure personally as a result, because you will get feedback, you will get information, you will get there will be a flow, very positive flow. You're also doing the right thing by the community. So it's actually the right thing to do, I think. And so actually everybody benefits to an extent. We learn about bad things that go wrong. And I think it can really elevate your trust, as Findlay said in the Marks and Spencer case. There's probably actually is almost trust benefit that comes from being relatively open about what goes on. Having said all that, there are situations in cryptography where people don't keep they use secret algorithms, they aren't transparent, and there are arguments for doing that as well. First of all, if you've got all the in-house expertise, as many organizations attending this event have, then you might not want to do that. If you're mainly looking after a closed system, there's no need for you to worry about speaking to the rest of the world. And also, if you're mainly worried about internal security, in a way you don't really care what the rest of the world thinks, then there are legitimate reasons for using secret algorithms and not being transparent. And again, I think we've got scenarios here where there are situations where it's possibly not working in your interest to disclose, but you would have to be very careful about what the implications of that are. And the caveat of following that approach, again, if we go back to the cryptography analogy, is if you decide to use secret algorithms and then they're later discovered, that doesn't look very good. And there's been a number of high-profile technologies where algorithms were reverse engineered, found not to be very strong, and therefore there were quite negative repercussions. And I think similarly with an operational side, if you have an incident, you don't declare it, and then later on the press discover it, that's actually probably a trust loss, in fact, because people go, oh, yeah, you did this, and you didn't tell anyone, you didn't do the right thing, but also maybe you have a trust deficit. So broadly speaking, I'm in favor of disclosure, but I think there are situations where it's justified not to do that, but that comes with its own risk. I think later on you're going to ask us about disclosure in university environments, and I'll give you a completely different answer.
I really like the analogy, and I guess, so for anybody that sort of studied computer science, cryptography, that idea of keeping an algorithm a secret and how that pairs out and can be almost overlaid to the same scenario is really interesting. So definitely left field, so that was great. Phil.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting from what my other panelists have been talking about is really thinking through that comms strategy, as you were saying, Findlay, and thinking, what would it mean if we were oversharing? What would it mean if we were undersharing? And just understanding the possible options that an organization would have, understanding the implications of if this information was to go out now, what could it do for us? Just to be able to understand those different options, play them out, scenario training and the like, just so that people have that kind of holistic view of things in terms of if this was to happen to us, how would we respond, how would we want to? And again, that timing piece, thinking about what do we need to tell people when this is happening? Do we need to tell them anything when it's happening? Again, it's that choice, and different organizations will take different kind of risk profiles on that. And then as it's playing out, again, like you were talking about with Marks and Spencer's, they were very good at keeping their customers informed. And it is about that, maintaining that trust and understanding, yes, even in the worst days that they were having, they still had that understanding that they were keeping their customers informed, their customers had their kind of backing to be able to work through it together. So it's really about how you involve people and just understand what your options are with the comms piece. And again, just thinking about the question that came in and seeing this 68% on the structured process, completely agree. I think this isn't something that an organization can do in silo. But you also don't want to be at the hands of only the regulators. So again, it's how do you open up that conversation to understand, all of the different possible options, and then agreeing together what that kind of shared governance would be.
But I think there are organisations that there are special organisations that would need to own all of that,
of course,
on their own.
Of course, yeah. Again, the risk profile of those organisations will, yeah.
That's great, thank you. So I think we'll move on to the next question. So that last question was really giving us an insight as to who we trust to take ownership of disclosure in terms of transparency. A second question moves us on from a moment in crisis and moves into relationships within security. We're going to look at supply chain. Can we have the timer started on the next question, because I've actually lost track of where we are. Thank you. Right, so question 2. So supply chain security depends heavily on trust and information sharing between partners of vastly different sizes and maturity levels. How do we build transparency into these relationships without placing disproportionate burdens on smaller suppliers? And I think, Natalie, you're going to kick us off on this one, aren't you?
Yes, thank you, Charles. So I think what I see, certainly in my role, as one of the biggest challenges is that a lot of the transparency mechanisms assume that organisations have the same level of capability, which they absolutely don't. I think that when there is a risk that when compliance simply becomes a compliance exercise, then certainly for those smaller organisations that don't have the same capability, it will then really quickly turn into a burden for them rather than being a meaningful exercise from which lessons can be learned. So I think it would be a useful focus to consider how the language there can shift from assurance to capability building, and what sort of work do we need to do with these smaller organisations and that sort of supply chain piece to help get them up to that standard. And I think that we have a role both from an academic perspective, but also involving industry and regulators as well, in terms of looking at working together to help these supply chains organisations and looking at what we can do to make the process simpler for them. How can we help them to understand what good looks like, and how can we help them to get to that level and measure their own risk as well? And I think a bit of that also comes not in terms of also making it simpler, but also in terms of helping it to be usable. The process needs to be usable, and I think that we all have a role to play in helping them to communicate that and also making sure that there are the right tools and framework in place to make it easy for them. Without that, I think it's going to be really, really difficult to get those organisations up to the level that they need to make sure that things are good.
Great. So there's a couple of things that you brought out there. The role to play. So being as we've got a predominantly academic panel, and we won't do it now because I'd like to hear your points first, but I do think there's an interesting part to look at, which is, what part does academia play in terms of how we might get towards what good looks like as well? Because at the end of the day, if we've got a workforce that are going into these roles, a lot of that workforce is coming through an academic institution of some sort. Keith?
No, I mean, this is a great question. I mean, the heterogeneity of the sort of partners and relationships in supply chain is frightening. I'm sure you've all seen that. I quite like this advert that's on all the rail stations at the moment, where the CEO brackets me had to speak to the head of IT brackets me about the person that clicked on the dodgy link brackets also me. And that is exactly what you're talking about here. And I think the analogy I would pick this time, sticking again with what I know, is a little bit like the university environment. A simple supply chain is almost described by our university system, because we have a central IT team trying to run a show, but they rely on subunits within the university that have their own computer systems for various historical reasons, and have their own labs. And then, of course, you've got a huge student community in a university that are walking in with their own devices, and they're all behind the internal barriers of the university. So there is a sort of supply chain at play there, where the largest number of players in the supply chain are the CEO brackets me, who had to speak to the head of IT brackets me. And so this is a very complex situation. And the problem the university has, it has no direct control over, well, barely its own academics, but also it can't control all these devices that are coming on, or at least it has to try and do that. It can't tell people what to do in a situation. Academics don't listen, and students are not going to read instructions. So how do they get around that? And I think the practices, I was looking at what our university does, and I think it is probably what you apply to a broader supply chain as well, is where you could do what you can do. So you give out information, you give out relevant information, you communicate as effectively as you can. You provide toolkits. So again, in the university environment, students are given access to multi-factor authentication technology, they're given access to free antivirus software. Again, in a broader supply chain, you could provide relevant toolkits. You provide platforms that are secure, and then you encourage to engage with the university. The students have to operate on these shared platforms, and in a supply chain, you can play a similar game. But I think also what's happening in the university more is also they're communicating quite well about problems, and I think, again, in the supply chain, having that dialogue is really, really important. But in the end, you're not in control. So in the end, it's about managing the risk. It is ultimately a risk management problem. You've got to manage that risk, and it's going to be bigger for the CEO brackets me, to speak to the head of IT brackets me, than it perhaps is for the computer science lab with its own network that have an IT person that knows a little bit about what they're doing. But you have to manage the risk differently across all of those categories. I also put your question through ChatGPT, Charles, if you want to know if I had a philosophical one-liner.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
so
yeah,
it said, regarding security as a shared journey, rather than a compliance hurdle, will lead to a healthy and strong and resilient ecosystems of the supply chain.
So that's interesting. So sycophantic.
That's not bad, actually.
It's not bad, but it's
shared journey.
It's got the nice, shiny, rosy.
Yeah,
idea,
I thought it was quite good.
But that's pretty good. And thanks for that, Keith.
Yeah.
Phil.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, a really challenging question. But again, just picking up on some of the points coming through on the slide, the clear communication, the clear expectations, and the one word in particular that's caught my eye is the proportionality. That issue that you've got that smaller organisation feeding into the larger organisation potentially. Is there a duty of care for that larger organisation to really work with them for them to understand? What does transparency mean so that they've got a mutually beneficial relationship between those two organizations? I mean, the other thing, again, as part of my prep and running things through ChatGPT, and they're like, software bill of materials, that is a really nice example from a software perspective of trying to at least understand, we've got this product, what is in it in terms of that software, the dependencies, the libraries. Are there other analogies that we can do for other aspects of the supply chain?
Thank you. Findlay.
So I really toil with this one because my practitioner view is you cannot divorce your obligations, through supply chain. The ownership and the liability fundamentally stops with whoever is that data owner, data processor. Now, if you give that over to a smaller independent, you'll have your contracts and so on. And this is where the liability clauses come in, and this is where it really trips a lot of people up. And unless you've got deep pockets to be able to match the requirements in these contracts, I think small businesses are on a hiding to nothing. So I think what organisations need to do is be realistic, it needs to be proportionate. There is no point trying to put all of these clauses around smaller businesses when, you know, they're very niche or they can't do that or they don't have that level of financial support. But there needs to be a risk acceptance to compensating controls to ensure that supply chain. And that's where the support, the communication, what is the other way that we can interact with these organisations, smaller, rather than not interacting with them at all? Because I think, you know, just because they're not ticking that box from, say, a big enterprise checklist, what else can we do from a compensating controls perspective? And also, that liability needs to be accepted by the person that owns that data.
So does regulation play a part there? And at the moment it might not, but if there were an obligation from the larger entity effectively having to take that responsibility as you described, would regulation help that? I'm just wondering how you mitigate this.
I think regulation can both help and hinder. So regulation won't tell you what to do. They give, you know, guidance and so on. So there's, you know, you've got DORA, you've got NIS2, you've got a whole host of different regulation out there, especially, you know, in this emerging resilience or environment that we're working in at the moment. So it does help, but equally it can also discount a lot of smaller entities that don't have the resources and so on and so forth. But there are ways around that, and I think, you know, it's whether these larger entities want to invest and support, you know, and show what their best practice is, and also consider other compensating controls, while still ensuring the integrity of the data and the services and so on and so forth.
Fantastic, thank you. So I am mindful of time, so we have to track it. So we're going to move to question 3. So we've been looking at transparency and external relationships. Our third question brings us on to a lens view from an academic institution standpoint in terms of, you know, what are their obligations to practice what they preach and what they teach. Right, so the question is, academia plays a vital role in researching and teaching cybersecurity, yet universities themselves are frequently targets. How transparent should educational institutions be about their own security challenges, and what lessons can the wider sector draw from their experiences? And Keith, you were leading us on this one.
Yes, this is where I rip up my answer. I rip up my answer to question 1. I was at an event 10 years ago run by the NCSC, and at that point we had an ecosystem of academic centres of excellence in cybersecurity research, and there were plans to launch a similar one in cybersecurity education. And a very enthusiastic member of the NCSC came down to me and said, "We've had a great idea. We're going to link that award to the cybersecurity of campuses themselves." And I sort of gritted my teeth and smiled, while I actually thought, oh no, where no was not the word I was thinking of at the time. So this is very alarming. I find this very alarming. By the way, fast forward, they did do that. They allied it to universities having, the academic teams having strong dialogues with their cybersecurity teams, and all the universities represented on the panel successfully got their awards, I think. So that's okay. It ended well. But the point was, universities are very hard environments to secure. In fact, they're probably very insecure. I have a friend who works at a university, so I can talk about their university. And one of the big problems we would have is legacy equipment on university networks. It's very hard for my friend's university to get cyber essentials partly because of this legacy backbone equipment that's on the network. We also have, of course, a very complex user community, as we talked about before, but the students are the customers, as well as employees in one sense, and they want to bring their own devices, multiple devices. It's very difficult to control what happens on those devices. In my friend's university, I can't speak on behalf of other ones, the IT team is very small, the security team is very small, and then most crucially, the university has absolutely no money. So all this piled together makes it quite a difficult and fragile, I think, system. And full credit to NCSC, obviously, for trying to encourage us to work towards improving these. But they're very fragile systems. So then when a university system is attacked, how transparent should they be? I'm now very reluctant to say you should go public, because actually you're already operating on a system which is clinging on a little bit. So I'm nervous in such situations to really recommend that should always happen. That said, the transparency that's really important, I think, is into a university, and I know that the teams at my friend's university speak regularly with teams at other universities, and there's a number of sharing networks that people who share the same problems, essentially, and I think that is really important. So I'm all in favour of that transparency. Slightly different answer that I gave to question one. But in terms of what can other organisations learn, well, there may be other organisations in the room who share the profile of a university, but if you don't do that, I think just be very grateful that you don't have the cyber estate that the university has, because I think it's a very difficult environment to secure. Yeah.
It's really interesting because you talked about the idea of institutions sharing, so institutions are like sort of sharing best practice, good practice, risks and concerns, and yet they don't have a formal information sharing and analysis centre set up within universities, which I always find, especially in the current climate, I find really surprising. So in aviation or automotive, you have those in place, but universities have just never done that.
I think it's informal. I think there is informal, though, and sometimes that's good enough. I mean, one of my students has been working on information sharing as part of a research project, and was actually working with cyber intelligence, threat intelligence, information sharing, and one of the things they observed in their thesis was in the MOD, for example, how important the Costa Coffee queue was for dialogue and communication. That's not formal information sharing, but he said a lot of information sharing is happening. I know Findlay has reservations about this in the Costa Coffee queue, and I think it's still important to have informal networks, sure, even if it's not formalized. And there is some formal common security for universities, as I think the Janet network is building a SOC, for example, that everyone can plug into. So, but I don't think we should underplay informal channels. Sure. But
do you think something formal is required, or do you think informal, given the nature of universities and no money and all the other bits? Not all universities, by the way. It's just Keith's friend's university.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think something formal would benefit? Potentially.
I think if informal networks are working, I don't. Sometimes this is the standard thing. Should the regulator step in? Should you formalize something that's working perfectly, and then you formalize it and it works less perfectly? Yeah. I don't know. I'm a bit agnostic on that. I think it depends how effective the the informal sharing is, and that I don't really know. I just know it's happening.
Great, thanks, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting, actually. Again, you mentioned about JISC, and so JISC do have partnerships to be able to link up with universities. And again, whether it's happening as much as we'd like, hard to say. But there is definitely information sharing of a sort. Could there be more? Possibly. But I think what's really interesting, again, just to echo some of Keith's points, understanding the university as a business where you've got lots of students, lots of staff, lots of stakeholders in very different ways, very different networks and systems running on that environment. Academics are the worst for spinning up shadow IT and the like, myself probably included, but still. So I fully empathize with our IT team, and I know they're possibly in this room even today. But as an ACE, we do work very closely with them to understand on a monthly basis, what are the challenges within the organization, within the business, and then what are we reporting from the academic conference on that. And I think, to take a slightly different turn on this, that transparency, kind of like I said in the first instance, it's that comms piece about how you release information, but more importantly, there's a real learning lesson here of when an incident has happened. Okay, we've got past it, the organization, the business have responded. what do we do there, Ben? The lessons learned, how does that feed back into your own institution and your students, and also to the wider academic community? And obviously, there have been cases in the last couple of years with universities being hit. So, and I know that there's some of those universities being represented at the conference. And actually, they've done a really good job of speaking publicly and saying, well, look, this is what it meant to us. This is how serious it was. But this is what we all need to take away from that. And I think it's encouraging that for our IT teams, our academic staff, and for our students as part of their learning process to understand the severity of this.
Let's go. Thank you. Findlay.
So what do I think about this? I think, and I acknowledge that universities and other public institutions get targeted. And I think the reason they get targeted is they know full well that funding is a problem. But equally and conversely, I see breaches coming through not just with universities. I mean, I'm part of a university myself, but other public institutions. And you can look at, I don't know, the NHS just as another kind of body. And from my perspective, I feel that there's some kind of tolerance by the public that says it's okay because, we know that they're not funded well, or if it's government run, it's okay. But when I work with people stateside, that just wouldn't happen. But again, it all comes down to funding. So my kind of interest in research is why, as citizens of the UK, are we okay to accept breach by public bodies, whether it be, universities or NHS or whoever, but we're not, about other bodies. That troubles me.
Yeah, but is that true if, I noticed that the slide was going, it depends entirely on the nature of the data systems involved. So if a university has its exam marked database attacked or hacked and exposed, is the public going to be tolerant of that? Because there might be a lot of people saying, that's all we do. They're supposed to look after exams. I don't know how tolerant they would be of that.
So, again, I wouldn't want to even hazard a guess on how tolerant they would be, but I do think there's a general,
There's a bit of sympathy.
Yeah. And also, it feels to me, when I got breached with one of the universities, I was like, well, there's no surprise, there is no funding behind that, and so on and so forth. So I do think funding has got a big part to play. So it's an expectation that, they've done their best. I don't think it's been deliberate or so on and so forth, but I do think, I understand why they've got a target on their back. But I do think that us as citizens accept the funding issue and therefore probably don't kick up.
Oh, that's very reassuring.
I think, again...
I'm feeling better.
I just think that's my perspective.
No worries. Can I have a time check, please? Because we've run over some of our questions. We've got one more question left. So how much time do we have left? So did you say 20 minutes?
10.
10 minutes.
10 at the back.
Oh, no, it's fine. That's
we'll have
we're bang on time. Right, so we'll do the last question. Right, so for each of those three questions we've had, we've assumed that there's a practitioner capable of navigating the decision. So our final question is going to be looking at how we produce them. So the question is, workforce development in cybersecurity often focuses on technical skills, but navigating transparency dilemmas requires judgment, communication, and ethical reasoning. How well are we preparing the next generation of practitioners for these challenges? And this isn't just an academia question, this is for all of us as a community. So, Phil, you are kicking us off on this one.
Thank you. So, again, really interesting question that we've been pondering, certainly in our institution, for a good few years now, actually. Because our students, we teach the technical aspects, we do the pen testing, we do the coding, we do all of that kind of stuff. And it's, actually those are important, do not get me wrong, those are very important skills for a cybersecurity student, but actually it's the communication, it's the critical thinking, it's the thinking on your feet, it's the responding to, well, have you thought about this, have you thought about that? Much like all of the questions we've been talking about today, it's all about decisions, isn't it? It's about, in the heat of that moment, what is the decision you're going to make when you're weighing up all of these different options, and how do you do that rationally with the information that you are presented with, and also recognizing that there is information that you are not presented with. You will not always have that clear picture. So when you've got incomplete information, how do you, as the learner, navigate that? And again, I mean, that is one of the big challenges that I would say a lot of our students, and students in general, let's say, face, actually. You know, they think, right, I need to know what it is I need to do for this task. And you might actually pose them a question. You say, well, actually, we don't know. You know, this is an open-ended task. It's for you to explore, identify the different options, and then justify which one you're going to do. And it might not be right, it might not be wrong, but you've got a justification to say, well, look, I don't know if it was the right course of action, but I've taken it, and this is the reason why. So I think there is a really important thing about that whole decision-making. How do we bring that in? I wanted to actually give a bit of a shout-out for the Cyber Leaders Challenge. It's an initiative that's been running for a couple of years in different guises, but it's been really crucial for our students, actually, who have taken part in this, where they've been given a brief and been able to respond in the heat of, well, not necessarily in the heat of the moment, but respond at short notice, let's say, speaking to an external panel, people they've never met, industry, government, etc. And it really does do that piece of bringing them out of their comfort zone, getting them speaking to different audiences. And the transformation we see of our students when they go through this process is phenomenal. And I mean, likewise, within our institution, we do this with industry, where we have industry projects. They set challenges for our students. They go off, they have 12 weeks, they come back, they pitch to those industry professionals. And again, with it not being the same old face as the academic team, but actually involving industry in that process, industry get a sense of our students get a sense of industry, and it's the questions that come afterwards where they go, oh, well, I wasn't expecting that, but I've given an answer. I've been able to think on my feet. And those are the kind of things which certainly, I want us to be nurturing with the learners who are coming through, so that they can communicate their ideas, they can critically reason, they can assess these different options and fundamentally say, well, based on everything I know and recognizing the things that I don't know, this is the course of action I want to go for.
That's right. Thank you. So aptitudes is a key part of it, so the opportunity to identify and then surface those aptitudes. Findlay, so bear in mind, we've got 6 minutes.
So I agree with everything that you said, and I like that approach. I think what we need to then do is just take that into industry, and then back to the first point that I made was, if this was a real scenario, what played out well, what could we have done better, and then go back and do that. So
yeah, and that's all
and just bringing that into practice.
Okay, Natalie.
Yeah, so just to add again, I agree with everything that's been said. I think, as Phil said, we focus a lot on teaching the technical skills, and that's what the students expect, it's what the students are comfortable with. The students are also typically very focused on their assessments. How can they get a good grade, and how can they get a good classification? And these skills are often seen by students as being kind of the fluffy stuff that kind of sits at the outside, and it can be difficult for us, I think, to get students on board with recognising the importance of them developing the skills. I think the language that we use around that, and we're moving into some of the competency bit, though, I think is really important. But I think we need to recognise, though, here that what's needed a lot of this, we've come back to the word judgment, and that isn't something that can be taught. It only comes with maturity and with experience, and that's something I think we need to recognise, that students will only really be able to fully develop once they are out in the world working. So I think we can prepare them, we can provide them with the foundations.
Your mic's on and off. Thanks.
Thank you. We can provide them with the kind of foundation to help them with that, but we need to recognise a lot of it will just come simply with time and experience in the roles, especially given, I think, some of the pressure situations that they are under when there is an ongoing cyber incident that they're expected to deal with.
Keith.
Well, I think the 2 generic skills we were talking about that are applicable to these transparency dilemmas are communications and judgment. I think universities have been very good at over the years of teaching communication skills. I think we do that very well. I think Phil has done an excellent job of persuading you that universities are very good at teaching judgment because they can do wonderful things. But the question is, are we? And I think we're doing really badly now at teaching judgment, not because we're doing things poorly, but because the world is changing underneath our feet. And what students are going to be doing now in the workplace is making judgments based on generative AI assessments, and they've got to benchmark and judge whether the things that are being output are things they should act on, or whether they should critique that. So I completely agree that we are teaching the principles, we are teaching the critical thinking skills, but I'm not sure I understand what my students are going to need to make judgments against this fast evolving Gen AI tools that they're going to be using. And I have access to free tools at the university. My students have all got pro tools, so they themselves are more expert than I am at doing this. They're going to go in the workplace, and they're going to be making the judgments against these tools. I think we've got an awful lot of catch up to do. So I do think we're still doing the right things. I don't disagree with you there, but I'm a bit more alarmed at how far off the pace we might be on helping them make judgments in this future. I think we can get there, we can catch up, but we've got a lot of catching up to do.
I mean, again, I agree. I think the whole Gen AI piece, absolutely fascinating, but absolutely terrifying in equal measure. Yeah. How does that change assessments? I mean, the higher education sector has had a lot of conversations about this in the last 2-3 years, let's say. But it is on us to be changing. You know, the institutions who say you can't use AI, personally, my take is the world is using AI.
Madness.
So it's on us to be thinking, well, what is a suitable assessment in a world where AI is just another tool in the toolkit? It's why Vivas and discussions, professional conversations, we've moved a lot of our modules to that mode of delivery, that mode of assessment, because fundamentally, we want to know what the student thinks in that moment, based on that conversation. It's really hard to scale that. That's the challenge. How do you do that when you've got a cohort of 300 students, for instance? But in the places where it matters, that's the way we've got to go. So professional conversations, Vivas, however you want to frame it, to really decide these are the things where I want to get their opinion, not see if they can run it through an AI chatbot.
All right, I think we have to conclude now. Is that right? We're literally 2 minutes left. 3 minutes? Right, thank you, John. So we've got 3 minutes. So one quick takeaway from everybody. If you've got anything you'd like to share as a takeaway for everybody that's here today.
Can I go first?
Yeah,
Thank
go
you.
on.
Thanks, Charles. So I think it's less about how much should we be transparent and who should be responsible for it, but how can we make that transparency usable, safe and accessible across the entire ecosystem, because without that we're not going to see capability and improvements actually develop.
Good, thank you. Keith?
Transparency in theory, yes. In practice, it depends.
All right. Phil?
I think for me, I've been talking about decision making, I've been talking about weighing up the options and actually understanding what your options are so that you can make the most well-informed choice that you possibly can, recognizing that it won't always be correct.
All right, thank you. And last but definitely not least, Findlay.
So for me, transparency, you can't be transparent in what you don't understand. For me, it's all about, having that operational visibility and having honest communication and the capability to back it up.
Brilliant, thank you. So I am going to thank our panellists. So thank you very much. If we can give a round of applause to the panellists. And very quickly, just a quick thank you to Chris, Georgina, Fiona, Gordon, and the team of Ray Leno. Thank you very much for joining us.